There are many things that have been criticized about the newest installment of the Star Wars franchise, and it's impossible to attribute its low ratings to any one thing in particular. But the thing that I personally kept coming back to was the lack of the development of one style of character. And that character is the villain. Over the course of the new trilogy, we've had a few villains. We start with the introduction of Adam Driver's character Kylo Ren, and later we're introduced to the Sith Master, Supreme Leader Snoke. This is a very familiar setup for Star Wars fans. We've had Vader and Palpatine, Maul and Palpatine, Dooku and Palpatine, Anakin and Palpatine. This rule of two is a Sith established rule that is not really mentioned in the Star Wars films. It's a rule created by the Sith that says there can only be two Sith at any given time. But for these movies, Palpatine is always the reigning puppet master. The rule of two follows a theme that exists in many other adventure story universes. There is always a secondary villain in the forefront, while the primary villain is operating from behind a veil. If we look at the Lord of the Rings for an example, early in the first film we are introduced to the primary villain in Sauron, but we are also introduced to the secondary villain that takes the forefront of the first and second films, Saruman, played by Christopher Lee. If we look at Harry Potter, we have Voldemort as the overarching villain, but are introduced to a new villain every film or book of the franchise. And in the original Star Wars trilogy, we had the Vader and Palpatine duo, where Vader took the forefront of all of the audience's attention, while Palpatine was merely a figure that you would meet later and learn more about. The thing that the newest two films of this franchise did not do that all of these other successful fantasy worlds have done, including the original trilogies of Star Wars, is develop their villains. The first film did a terrific job of creating setup for developing Kylo and Snoke as characters. We see early on that Kylo Ren is clearly a flawed character, with a tragic past and a troubled conscience. He's almost like a less mature and more emotional Anakin. And when Snoke is introduced, we as an audience were eager to learn more about this mysterious new villain. Who was he? Where did he come from? Who taught him how to use the Force? There were even theories floating around that he was in fact Palpatine's old master, Dark Plagueis the Wise, or Palpatine himself. We had this knowledge that we would learn more about this new character as the story progressed and the rebels took on the First Order. The setup continued into the second film, and tensions were high in Snoke's throne room as Rey and Ren fought it out. But the writers did something unexpected that a lot of Star Wars fans had mixed feelings about, myself in particular. They killed Snoke off in a very sudden and unexpected way. But when they decided to kill off Snoke, they did more than just kill a bad guy. They killed all of the sense of urgency and threat that we as an audience felt. Sure, we knew that the heroes needed to escape from the forces of their enemy, but Kylo was effectively made into the supervillain. More importantly, the buildup of this new and intriguing character was destroyed without answering any of the questions that we had. Sitting in the theater for The Last Jedi, I felt like I had been robbed or cheated at cards. The development was unfinished by his unexpected demise. And my assumption is that the entire reason for killing Snoke was to do something unexpected. But creating something unexpected for the sake of surprising the audience has no more effect than a jump scare in a horror flick. It's interesting for a moment and we get excited, but it's not what makes the film successful. The other issue is that we already know Ren. We know his flaws, weaknesses, strengths, and we can expect to anticipate his actions. He's a very predictable character. And because of this, we had no questions that needed answering and no real call to action for the final film that we all knew was going to come. Now moving on to The Rise of Skywalker, the sins really start to add up for this film. We're quickly introduced to a new villain, or rather, an old one. They threw Palpatine at us, this brand new villain, without developing it first. Nobody expected him to have anything to do with this new story until the trailer was released and we heard his iconic laugh. There was no time to develop his story or incorporate his old story or him in general into the new one that already existed. In the hero's journey, the story traditionally resolves itself when the villain is defeated for good. Vader fulfills his destiny and destroys the evil Emperor. Frodo destroys the ring and Sauron with it. Harry destroys the Horcruxes and kills Voldemort. These are some examples that are very popular within pop culture and film franchises in general. The only time we see a new villain inserted into a movie franchise is when that franchise is not one continuous story. An example might be a film that is very successful for its initial launch, but was only meant to be a one-off. This new Star Wars franchise was planned to be a trilogy from the very beginning, which is why we were so thrown off. The writers treated the new Star Wars films as independent from one another, with the character development that they did do, and lost sight of the big picture plot elements that Lucas based his entire franchise off to begin with. We can cut the writers a little bit of slack in that Palpatine does explain that he did create Snoke, so he technically was the puppet master from the very beginning. But this explanation is made as a mere side comment between Kylo Ren and Palpatine. The question of who is this big bad villain from 2 entire movies in this new franchise, this interesting character that we're seeing developed. Oh, he was just some clone made in a vat, and you have 10 seconds to explain that or less. And that's it. That's all we get. On another note, you would think that the writers would learn from the failures of the final Game of Thrones season, another of my favorite television shows, that you can't kill off the big bad villain without sufficiently explaining the questions that the audience has, and then go on to create more episodes expecting the audience to accept the brand new villain that you just threw in front of them and created on a whim. Star Wars does the same thing here, except with a movie series instead of a streaming television series. There were plenty of other cliche things that The Rise of Skywalker did, like have the hero be the offspring of the big bad guy, or have unexpected help arrive at the last minute, similar to something that we've seen in, Avatar. But those sins could be forgiven if there wasn't such a hole in the plot when it came to the villain. A villain is something that is at the core of every great adventure. Movie, series, book franchise, it doesn't matter. They need to have a goal, and whether it's clear or hidden from the audience shouldn't matter, but it should be clear at the end. It needs enough time to develop on the screen and in the minds of everybody watching. They can't be pulled from a hat and made to dance around with the expectation that the audience will be entertained, captivated, and intrigued by their presence. And that is exactly what happened when we saw Palpatine swinging around on his giant robotic arm. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed the newest film, just in the sense that it has lasers and lightsabers, and some Star Wars elements that just gave me a sense of nostalgia. But it left so much to be desired, and the biggest part of that was the lack of a true villain. I hope you enjoyed this review, or rather, criticism of Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker. If you want to see more reviews or movie critiques like this one, consider subscribing below, or check out my website at icepire.com.